I don't know how to introduce Joel exactly because his credits are who he is actually. And so, as he's already shared here, he was here a long time ago. Got to spend some time with Franklin. Actually did some filming too. Did a film of Franklin and Diane was in that film.
Van Harrison.
Yeah, Ben, she's still in touch.
Yeah.
Sent a picture of her gorgeous daughter. Although he hasn't been back that often, he has been back, and it's always been a very worthwhile adventure when he comes, and he's had some very interesting things to do and say while he's here. So, you all know Joel, I know.
Well, we've all met already, so we don't have to introduce ourselves. I will say this, that my official title is the Spiritual Director of the Center for Sacred Sciences. And I put a bunch of pamphlets out there on the table with yogis literature. If you're interested, you can pick one up, and if you are further interested, you can check out our website, which is a very thorough website, and you can find out a lot more about us and all that stuff. So I don't want to take up your time with that, though, this afternoon. One of the things we do at the center is sift through the teachings of mystics of all the great traditions, trying to ferret out the universal principles. It's not to say that what's unique about a particular tradition isn't important, but at least in my path, I always found it very persuasive when I could find something that, let's say, Meister Eckhart said, and then I'd be reading a Buddhist book, and the same thing is there, and then the same thing is in the Bhagavad Gita, and say, there must be something to this. These mystics from different times, places, cultures, and they're all coming to this intersubjective agreement, as it's called in philosophy departments these days. So I thought what we'd do today is look at a section of Wolff's report about the final stage of his path, and examine it, and then see how much of it is attested to by mystics of other traditions, and then see how it might illuminate our own paths. So that's kind of a tall order, but I hope that we can all get something out of it. So I'm going to be reading a paragraph and then a part of a footnote from that account, and I'll tell you when we get there if you want to follow along. But I do want to emphasize that the fact that this is an account of the final stage of his path is, as Dr. Wolff would have said, of paramount importance, because it doesn't necessarily mean that we can all, jump to that stage and apply what he says immediately in our lives. By his own reckoning in Consciousness, the Philosophy of Consciousness Without an Object, his path took almost 25 years, and he did a lot of work in that 25 years. A lot of work, as he puts it, on affectively, that is on emotions, and cognitively, in terms of will and volition. So that's all a very important context to keep in mind when we go through this. Especially, I want to say, digress and say, especially today, where there are a lot of teachers who say, oh, don't worry about any practices, don't worry about any of this, just relax and realize yourself. I mean, would that it was all that simple. So let me read this two paragraphs, or half of a paragraph from the main body of the text, and then I'll read you the footnote, and then we will go back through it, and we will start to go through it piece by piece. So the first shot, I'm just going to read it through. If you want to follow it, it's on pages 36 to 37 in the Philosophy of Consciousness Without an Object, and it's on page 263 in Experience and Philosophy. So. Forgive me if I stumble sometimes. My vision isn't what it used to be. That's 36 to 37 in the philosophy. Okay, so if you'll find where it starts in the middle of the paragraph, while engaged in this course of reflection.
Yes.
Everybody got that? Okay. While engaged in this course of reflection, it suddenly dawned on me that a common error in meditation, and one which I had been making right along, lay in seeking a subtle object or experience. Now, an object or experience, no matter how subtle, remains a phenomenal time-space existence, and therefore is other than the supersensible substantiality. Thus, the consciousness to be sought is a state of pure subjectivity without an object. This consideration rendered clear to me the emphasis, repeatedly stated by the manuals, upon the closing out of the modifications of the mind. But I never found it possible to completely silence thought. So it occurred to me that success might be attained simply by a discriminative isolation of the subjective pole of consciousness, with the focus of consciousness placed upon this aspect, but otherwise leaving the mental processes free to continue in their spontaneous functioning, they, however, remaining in the periphery of the attentive consciousness. Further, I realized that subjective consciousness without an object must appear to the relative consciousness to have objects. Hence, recognition did not of itself imply a new experiential content in consciousness. I saw that genuine recognition is simply a realization of nothing, but a nothing that is absolutely substantial and identical with the self. All capital letters, self. And then there's a footnote in that paragraph, footnote 9, and if you, or an endnote really, and if you turn to page 81 in the philosophy and page 294 in philosophy and experience, you will find this endnote 9. And this is the part I'm going to read. The final thought before the breakthrough was the very clear realization that there was nothing to be attained. For attainment implied acquisition, and acquisition implied change of content of consciousness. But the goal is not change of content, but divorcement from content. Thus, recognition has nothing to do with anything that happens. I am already that which I seek, and therefore there is nothing to be sought. By the very seeking, I hide myself from myself. Therefore, abandon the search and expect nothing. This was the end of the long search. I died, and in the same instant was born again. Spontaneity took over in place of the old self-determined effort. So that's very rich material. So let's go back through it now and take it in smaller bites so we don't have to try to digest it all at once. And as I said, see how it compares with what other mystics have said and see how we might be able to actually learn from this for our own path. I always like to bring Dr. Wolff's philosophy back to something practical. We should be able to come away with it, something that we can actually work with or do. That's my approach to reading his philosophy. So, Wolff starts by describing a mistake. And it's a mistake he's been making for years here, as he says. And here's what he says. While engaged in this course of reflection, it suddenly dawned on me that a common error in meditation, and one which I had been making right along, lay in seeking a subtle object or experience. So you can ask yourself, well, when I sit down to meditate, especially if I'm ambitious and think, well, maybe this meditation is the one, where lightning is going to strike. What am I doing in this meditation? Am I looking for something different to happen? Am I looking for some subtle object to appear, a platonic form, or some new experience I've never had before? Maybe something I couldn't even describe, it's so subtle, but something, must be something different than this dreary old reality I'm stuck with. Has that ever happened to anybody here? This looking for something different? Now notice, he's calling this an error. And don't feel bad. He's made this error for, 20 years. So one of the things we can sometimes learn is a little shortcut. We don't have to make the same mistakes over and over that other people made. We can learn from that. So then he goes on to tell us why it's a mistake. Now, an object or experience, no matter how subtle, remains a phenomenal time-space existence, and therefore is other than the supersensible substantiality, by which he simply means ultimate reality or consciousness itself without a subject and without an object, or whatever other synonym you want for that. So anything that appears is limited, finite, and temporal. It's going to disappear. Whatever arises is going to pass. This is something else. Again, we can check out our own experience. It's a wonderful practice to do, and many traditions encourage this, and it's usually a opening into a spiritual path to really convince yourself there is absolutely nothing in our experience that remains and stays. It's all transient, it all arises, it all passes. It's all a time-space phenomenal existence, as he puts it. So if we're just looking for another phenomenon, even a very spectacular one, even a very beautiful one to arise, well, it's still going to be part of that time-space existence. It's still going to be a phenomenon. And it might hang around for a long time. It might be very gratifying. He's not knocking, saying all this is worthless, but it won't be what you're looking for if you are looking for that supersensible substantiality. So then he goes on. Thus, the consciousness to be sought is a state of pure subjectivity without an object. Now, we've run across this before, earlier when we were talking about discussing the aphorisms, weren't we? So what is a consciousness, what is a state of pure subjectivity that has no objects in it? And then I'm skipping now, there was a kind of a digression, I'm skipping down to the end, and he says, thus the I saw that genuine recognition is simply a realization of nothing. And I would like to read that with a hyphen in there.
No thing.
I saw the genuine recognition is simply a realization of no thing, but a no thing that is absolutely substantial and identical with the self. So consciousness without an object, or ultimate reality, is not a thing. Whatever no thing is, it is not a thing. Definitely. So anything that appears in consciousness ain't it. You can just eliminate that. So let's stick with this idea, though, that ultimate reality is not a thing. It's a nothing. Is this just something Dr. Wolff sort of figured out on the eve of his awakening? Or what do other mystics say about this? Here's the great Tibetan master Longchenpa. He was one of the great classic Tibetan masters. The innate primordial wisdom, free from the duality of percept and mind, can only be signified by realizing, but there is nothing to be shown and nothing to see. Okay? Here's what the Christian mystic Meister Eckhart says. You should love God as he is a non-God, a non-spirit, a non-person, a non-image, but as he is a pure, unmixed, bright one, separated from all duality. And in that one, we should eternally sink down out of something into nothing. And here's the 20th century Hindu mystic Anandamayi Ma, and here's what she says. Where nothing is, there is everything. All efforts are for the sake of this realization. So, that's pretty good confirmation, isn't it? It's interesting about Dr. Wolff. I mean, he figured this out. I think Ron said, how'd you describe his path earlier? Self-induced
self-devised
Right.
means.
But it doesn't mean he's discovering something that hasn't been discovered before.
Yeah.
Well, he added, and I didn't use the term, but grace is involved in that too.
Well, we're gonna get to that one too. Okay, so but one thing we can learn from this, each of us can learn. If you are looking for anything, you're barking up the wrong tree. And that's something you can just learn in your meditation. Now, there are all sorts of meditations that aren't aimed at directly realizing enlightenment that are very valuable. There are meditations for concentration. They're meditations to get to know the moment-to-moment impermanence of experience and all sorts of other things. But if you're sitting down and you're saying, okay, this is it, I'm ready, I'm going to find it, and you're looking for something, you're looking in the wrong place. Yeah.
Could I contribute how I view this no thing?
Sure.
Wolff, in his book, he talks of consciousness, and he tries to come up with a simple definition of what it is, and he says, that which lessens as you fall asleep and that which increases as you are awake. And I guess we all get the general sense of what he means by that, right? So how I understand what he means by nothing is, think of very deep sleep, so your consciousness is almost non-existent, but think of yourself remaining aware at that point of, mind is infinity, let's say. And I think that describes what he refers as the no thing, because at that point you're asleep, you're very deeply asleep, and there's nothing in your field of awareness. But however, you are still magically aware. And that's how I understand it.
And that's actually practices in the Hindu tradition to use dreamless sleep as an opportunity to awaken. So it's excellent. But actually his meaning of consciousness without an object, the way he's using it here is a little bit different, as we're going to find out just in a moment. So Wolff goes on. Further, I realized that subjective consciousness without an object must appear to the relative consciousness to have objects. Hence, recognition did not of itself imply a new experiential content in consciousness. This is, at least for me, probably the toughest part of the whole passage. So, if you're waiting for dreamless sleep, not that dreamless sleep isn't an extremely valuable state to be in, but you don't have to wait for dreamless sleep, because consciousness without an object is right now. It appears to have objects to the deluded mind.
That's the key.
So we look around, we're seeing objects. It's appearing to us as though it had objects. So when in dreamless sleep, there's a huge change of content. All this goes away, which is fine. But as we know from the aphorisms, it's irrelevant. Consciousness without an object is, regardless if they're objects or the absence of objects. So we don't have to necessarily wait for dreamless sleep.
That's true.
Right? And I think one way to interpret this is to say, in reality, there are no individual objects. He uses the word appear. It appears to have objects, but somehow that's not true. We're missing something. So let's check this against mystics of other traditions. Here's what Shankara says, and I think most of you know that Shankara was Yogi's guru. I mean, he talks about when he found Shankara, he found his guru, even though Shankara's been dead, hundreds of years, thousands of years. But anyway, he was very influenced by Shankara. So here's what Shankara says. This entire universe of which we speak and think is nothing but Brahman. And Brahman is the Hindu term for ultimate reality. Is nothing but Brahman. There is nothing else. Man drinks the wine of Maya, delusion, and becomes deluded and begins to see things as separate from each other, so that he talks of you and I. So, what Shankara is saying is, we're looking around, we see things as separate from each other, but that's not the case, really. Things aren't. We're just seeing Brahman. There's nothing else but Brahman. Here's Zen Master Wang Po, and Ron mentioned that the Zen tradition was not Yogi's favorite, but here's what Wang Po says. That which is before you is it, in all its fullness, utterly complete. There is naught besides. Let's take a moment to just absorb that in terms of our experience. This is it. Utterly complete in all its fullness, and there's nothing besides. Here's what Meister Eckhart says. You judge whether you think he's talking about the same insight. Everything stands for God, and you see only God in all the world. So again, you can just sit here and look around, and he's saying, what you're seeing is God. You might not know it. This particular passage, the Meister Eckhart, I read this long before I even heard of Dr. Wolff. This would drive me crazy, and actually, I'd be meditating, and I lived in this little cabin up in Topanga Canyon, and I'd read this stuff, and then I'd meditate, and then I'd read some more, and then I'd sit back and I'd read something like this, and I'd pick up my meditation pillow, and I'd look at it and say, well, Meister Eckhart sees God. I don't see God. I see a pillow. What's wrong with my perception? Where's the veil? What's going on here? But isn't this what Yogi's saying? And this is why he says, recognition does not require a change of content in consciousness, like going to dreamless sleep. You don't have to go anywhere. This is it, as Wang Po says, complete in all its fullness. But, according to Yogi, it does require detachment from contents. And that's, I think, the rub. At least it always was for me. An undistracted attention.
Yeah.
So, Yogi says, the goal is not change of content, but divorcement from content. And this is especially from thoughts. And you'll find, again, the same thing in other traditions. Shankara, again, says, in nirvikalpa samadhi, kalpa means something roughly equivalent to imagination or the power of thought. And nirva is a negative. So when they're non-thought, and it's often translated as no thought. In nirvikalpa samadhi and in no other state, the true nature of Brahman is clearly and definitely revealed. In any other state, the mind remains unstable. It is filled with distracting thoughts. So the key here is being distracted by thought. Now, there are practices that we all know, and especially in the Hindu tradition, of entering these deep states of samadhi where they're like really lucid dreamless sleep, where there are no thoughts. So that's one way to deal with distracting thoughts. It takes tremendous effort. I mean, at least I've tried to do a little of that, and especially for someone leading a householder's life. I guess if you want to go off to the cave up there, go live at the ashrama for a winter, which you can do, by the way. Chris did that. You might, you have all day long here to do. There's nothing else when you're snowed in. You might, work at this concentration and so forth. But it isn't necessary. It's being distracted by thought that's the problem. Here's what Lama Gendan Rinpoche, another Tibetan, says. This perception of the essence of mind takes place when all previous thoughts have come to a stop and the next thought has not yet appeared. The mind is in the spontaneous present, its own reality. It is the mind which sees its own essence, and this is what we call primordial wisdom. So now he's talking about a space when one thought has disappeared and before the next thought arises. we actually even touched on this because you raised this, Jessica, about what does it mean to have an absence of thought? How could you know that, you know? And this is a Tibetan practice where you get very good at first being able to identify a thought and then being able to follow it until it disappears completely. And then there's a moment where there's nothing before the next thought arises. Here's what the anonymous Christian author of the great Christian classic, The Cloud of Unknowing, says. When distracting thoughts annoy you, try to pretend that you do not even notice their presence, or that they have come between you and your God. Look beyond them, over their shoulder as it were, as if you are looking for something else, which of course you are. For beyond thoughts, God is hidden in the dark cloud of unknowing. So again, it's distracting thoughts here are the problem. And why, though? I think you'll find if you start paying attention to your thoughts, it's very difficult to remain detached or divorced from your thoughts because they weave stories from anything that's going on. Something in your environment, you know, the clock sounds. Oh, I start remembering when I was up here with Yogi, sitting in this chair. You know what? Just stimuli from the environment. If not that, your own memories arise. And immediately the thinking mind grabs on them and starts creating a story. A fascinating story. It's what I call the story of I, because of course who's the star of the story? Me. And then what's going to happen to me, and you know, what's is there anything I have to be afraid of, and all this stuff. And so we get absorbed in these stories that thoughts create. So this is why there's so much emphasis, you read any traditions, about somehow freeing our attention from thought, from the enthrallment of thought, the bondage of thought, however you want to put it. So, as long as we are distracted by thoughts, as long as we're wrapped up in a story, we're distracted from nothing. This is all things. This is all phenomena. So we're not paying attention to nothing, we're paying attention to something. So, Dr. Wolff continues. This consideration rendered clear to me the emphasis repeatedly stated by the manuals upon the closing out of modifications of the mind. But I never found it possible to completely silence thought. Have you ever, any of you ever found it possible to completely silence thought, at least for a prolonged period of time? But yogi is not different than us. He's grappled with this for years, and he's read these manuals, and he's tried to do these practices and tried to stop thought and all that. He never was able to do it. After 20 years, if you've been doing this, 5 years, don't spend another 15 years trying to do it. Again, unless you go up to the Himalayas, you probably are not going to succeed. I mean, Dr. Wolff was pretty dedicated, pretty concentrated, pretty disciplined. So, anyway, he couldn't do it. So it occurred to me that success might be attained simply by a discriminative isolation of the subjective pole of consciousness, with the focus of consciousness placed upon this aspect, but otherwise leaving the mental processes free to continue in their spontaneous function. They, however, remaining in the periphery of the attentive consciousness. So does everybody follow that, what he's talking about? He's not going to try to stop his thoughts. He's not going to try to change his thoughts or control them. He's going to withdraw attention from them. And I'm using a spatial metaphor, which is very gross for this, but turn it around and try to look at what is the source of attention itself. What we refer to as the subject of consciousness, or subject to consciousness. So, and then, as he's always said elsewhere, the subject to consciousness can never appear as an object before consciousness. So it can't be a thing. So we're looking for nothing, and that's synonymous with the subjective pole of consciousness. It's not a thing. So again, let's look at other traditions. Is this maneuver something that Dr. Wolff just discovered this time, or is this something else that's been known to mystics of other traditions? Here's Ramana Maharshi, the great Hindu mystic of the last century. If the mind is turned inward toward the source of illumination, objective knowledge ceases, and the self, with a capital S, alone shines as the heart. Isn't like that the same maneuver? When the mind is turned inwards towards the source of illumination, isn't that just another way of saying towards the subjective pole of consciousness? Here's Zen Master Dogen. Stop the intellectual practice of investigating words and chasing after talk. Study the backward step of turning the light and shining it back. Body and mind will drop away of themselves, and your original face will appear. And finally, here's Meister Eckhart again. If this will turns away from itself and from all creation for one instant and back to its first source, then the will stands in its true and free state, and it is free, and in this instant all lost time is restored. And see, you have to be careful when you read mystics of different traditions. First of all, they use words slightly differently. Second of all, at least I'm always reading translations. I don't speak Tibetan, I don't speak German or whatever. He says, if this will turn away from itself and from all of creation for one instant, and in Christian terminology, the ego self and will are very identified. There's this idea of surrendering your will to God's will. The will is like the linchpin of not of our true self, but our ego self. So turning away from that self and turning back to its real source. So again, this is something that other mystics of other traditions have talked about. Yogi's discovered it on his own, which is, brilliant. It's great, but it's not that he's discovered really anything new. Not something new in terms of the ontological side, but even not something new in terms of the epistemological side, the practice, how one might do this. So, it's very important, though, to realize that this turning attention back to its source is not looking for something that isn't already present. Somebody said maybe we just don't know it, and in a certain sense that's correct. We don't know it and we don't realize it, but it's something that is here and now. And in fact, as Yogi goes on to say, at this point when we've turned attention back, at this moment, we have to surrender all our seeking for anything. We have to surrender the search. And here's what Dr. Wolff says. The final thought before the breakthrough was the very clear realization that there was nothing to be attained. I am already that which I seek, and therefore there is nothing to be sought. By the very seeking I hide myself from myself, therefore abandon the search and expect nothing. I am already that which I seek. So just like we can sit here and look out and say, okay, this is it. And all its fullness and all its richness, we look at the objective field of consciousness, so to speak, and there's nothing has to change. There's nothing has to be improved upon. It's what the Tibetans call the great perfection. But if we just try to then get a sense of ourselves, there's nothing missing there either. We already are that. We already are that consciousness without a subject and without an object. You can't possibly attain it. Even though mystics, will talk in practical terms about attaining it, and you should focus on attaining this realization, and even Dr. Wolff and other places in the book. But now we're in the last stage of practice here. That's why I have to emphasize this. Here's what Huang Po says. Bodhi is no state. The Buddha did not attain to it. Sentient beings do not lack it. It cannot be reached with the body nor sought with the mind. All sentient beings are already of one form with the Buddha. Isn't that exactly what Dr. Wolff said? There's Ramana Maharshi again. There is no reaching the self. If the self were to be reached, it would mean that the self is not here and now, but that is, and that it is yet to be obtained. So I say the self is not reached. You are the self. You are already that. Right? Same thing. Here's the Sufi. The Sufis are the mystics of Islam. Abdullah Ansari of Herat. To seek you is a remnant of separation. You are before everything. So what would it mean to seek you? This is an interesting way of putting it. When we seek, attention goes out. But he's saying the divine is before we go out. This is kind of what Yogi was saying about when I seek, I'm actually hiding myself from myself. I'm turning attention in the wrong direction. It's the very movement of attention away that is hiding our true nature. So then Dr. Wolff describes his breakthrough. This was the end of the long search. I died and in the same instant was born again. Spontaneity took over in place of the old self-determined effort. Now, you notice at this point he starts waxing poetical. This is a poetic image of spiritual death. He doesn't have words to describe in a philosophical sense. This would never pass muster in a doctorate. A thesis would it for a doctorate, unless you were going to make a philosophical analysis of it. But it comes to his mind, and he may have run across this image before. He was, had read a lot of stuff. But it is so common. You find it in every tradition. The great Christian mystic Teresa of Avila used to compare the soul on the spiritual quest, or the self on the spiritual quest, to a silkworm, and that eventually transforms into a butterfly. So here's what she says about that. She says, "Note very carefully, daughters, the silkworm has of necessity to die, and it is this which will cost you the most." And spiritual death is a big image all through Christian mysticism. You'll find St. John of the Cross uses it, Bonaventure uses it, and so forth. Here's the Sufi poet Rumi. "The saint has died to himself and become living through the Lord. Hence God's mysteries are upon his lips." And even in Buddhism, at least I haven't found too many of these death metaphors, but you will find it in Buddhism. Here's the Buddhist Lokottara Sutra describing enlightenment. "There has been an inconceivable transformation death, by which the false imagination of his particularized individual personality has been transcended by a realization of his oneness with the universalized mind of Buddhahood, from which realization there will be no recession." So, really, everything Dr. Wolff discovered at the end of his path had already been discovered by other mystics. There is, Ron said, all roads lead to Rome, or something to that effect, and it's true. By whatever means, these mystics anyway, all came to the same gate. In Zen, it's often called the gate of emptiness, which is another term for the gate of nothing. Now, Dr. Wolff does go on to describe, which I didn't read here, this nothingness as being, however, the ultimate fullness. So somebody is bringing up, yes, it is not a nothingness like a vacuum, like a physical vacuum. And that's a problem Buddhists run into all the time with their word shunyata and void. People take it to be a physical vacuum, and Buddhist teachers always having to say, no, it's full of the potentiality of all the manifestations of Dharmakaya and everything else, because it sounds very nihilistic. And Yogi certainly doesn't mean this nihilistically. But again, this is an instruction. It's not a philosophy. It's an instruction of where to look. Where are we going to look? And you can boil it down, instead of looking for things, for something, no matter how spectacular, no matter how beautiful, no matter how subtle, no matter how profound, look for nothing. And maybe I'll leave you with one just image about this that I got from a Tibetan teacher. I had a Tibetan meditation teacher. And there's a tanka, I think it's called the Wheel of Time mandala. And it's a representation of the cosmos as the Tibetans see it. And it's a representation, this is a representation of samsara, the world of delusion as the Tibetans see it. And they have all these rings, and each one is filled with pictures that represent doctrines they have about reincarnation and about the 12 conditioned arisings and this and that. And it all comes down to the center hub. And in the center hub, there is a rooster chasing a snake and biting the tail feathers of the snake. And the snake is biting the tail of a pig, and the pig is biting the tail of a rooster. So they're going round and round like this, see, in the middle of the whole universe. And the Tibetan, our teacher said, now, the rooster represents grasping. Self-centered grasping. The snake represents pushing away, aversion. And the pig represents indifference, not high indifference, dull indifference. And he says this is the dynamic that drives all samsara. And we're, well, wow, And then he says, and you can see this in your meditation. We were about to meditate. We're doing simple meditation, just simple breath, concentration on the breath. And he says, there you'll sit down and you'll be meditating. You get into the state, and thoughts recede, and there's stability and clarity and maybe a little bliss. And you think, oh, this is wonderful. This is why I'm meditating. Oh, yes, if I can only hang on to this. There's the rooster. And then you meditate for a while longer, and that state dissolves away, and thoughts come, and they're distracting, and you can't concentrate, and you're never going to get this meditation, and you don't know if you're ever going to do this again. There's the snake, the aversion, the pushing away. And you're sitting there, and you're doing this for half an hour, and it's going round and round, and about 20 minutes into the meditation, you just don't give a shit anymore. And there's the pig. And so now, if you watch that in your meditation, you see the dynamic that's driving all of samsara from the emotional point of view, more emotional than the intellectual point of view. And then you carry that out into your life. And you see yourself on the job or in relationships with people or whatever. It's a very helpful image for me anyway to use. And whenever you see it, what should you do? Well, what you'll do is you'll try all sorts of things, which is great. You should experiment, do whatever you can. But just whatever you do, don't just let it roll on in its old conditioned way. You'll try to interrupt it. You'll try to do this, whatever. But at least you'll be interrupting the pattern. At least it won't just be unconsciously driving everything forward. So I think this is really important, and often we focus on yogi's highest teachings or anybody's highest teachings, and we skip over, oh, that's 25 years, and it's really important not to. So that was my talk.